Imagine stepping onto a plane, holding your first-class ticket, dressed elegantly but not trying to show off, simply expecting a peaceful journey ahead. Now imagine being treated like you don't belong there, like you're some sort of imposter who snuck past the gate, and then being told you're not welcome on the very flight you actually own a major stake in. That is exactly where this story begins. And before I even go further, let me tell you, you're going to want to stay till the end because the twist that happened at 30,000 feet left everyone on board stunned, including the crew, the passengers, and most of all, the flight attendant who thought she was just enforcing the rules. But before we dive all the way into this unbelievable series of events, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because here on our channel we bring you stories that not only entertain, but also inspire, stories that remind you how quickly people judge others based on appearances, and how truth has a way of surfacing in the most dramatic fashion. So, let's rewind to the start of this unbelievable day in the life of an undercover billionaire. She had planned this trip weeks in advance, but not because she needed to travel. After all, she owned private jets and had access to luxury at her fingertips. No, she booked this flight because she wanted to experience firsthand what everyday passengers were going through on her airline, the one she had invested billions into improving. She had disguised herself in simple clothing, plain jeans, a loose sweater, sneakers that had seen better days, and her hair tied in a casual bun. To the average eye, she looked like an ordinary middle-aged woman, maybe someone struggling to make ends meet. That was exactly the point. She didn't want anyone to recognize her. She wanted to blend in, to see how her employees treated passengers when they thought no one important was watching. What she didn't expect, however, was that this experiment would backfire so dramatically. The moment she approached the boarding gate, she could already feel the tension. The airline had overbooked the flight, as many airlines do, and passengers were being told they would need to give up their seats. She held her first-class boarding pass confidently, but the agent at the counter glanced at her up and down, eyebrows tightening in skepticism, as though the ticket in her hand couldn't possibly be hers. She felt the sting of judgment, but said nothing, allowing the process to unfold. When she finally boarded, she took her seat quietly, trying not to draw attention. But it didn't take long before a flight attendant approached, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. The attendant stood over her with that forced polite smile that was polite in words but sharp in tone, the kind that instantly made the undercover billionaire feel unwelcome in a space she had every right to occupy. "Ma'am, can I see your boarding pass again?" the attendant asked, her voice betraying doubt as if she expected the slip of paper to reveal a mistake. Calmly, she handed it over, knowing it was valid, knowing she had not only purchased the ticket, but technically financed the very cabin she was sitting in. The attendant frowned slightly, scanned it, then looked back at her with a raised brow. "First class is reserved for premium passengers, and this seat appears to be incorrectly assigned," she muttered. Passengers nearby began to glance curiously, some whispering, some smirking as if they already concluded she must have made some error or tried to sneak in. She felt the burn of their silent judgments, but kept her composure, speaking gently. "This is my seat. There must be some mistake." But the attendant wasn't convinced. "We'll need you to move to economy until this is cleared up," she insisted. At that moment, something shifted in the billionaire's chest. Not anger, not arrogance, but a deep ache at how quickly people jump to conclusions based on appearances. Still, she played along, curious to see just how far this prejudice would stretch. She gathered her belongings and moved back, walking through the narrow aisle lined with passengers who now looked at her as though she had been caught red-handed trying to cheat the system. Every step was humiliating, and yet she carried herself with quiet dignity. Once seated in economy, squeezed between two strangers, she overheard a few passengers joking softly. Guess first class wasn't for her after all. She smiled faintly to herself, not because she found it funny, but because she realized this small social experiment had already revealed more than she expected. The flight took off, and the hours ticked by with the hum of engines filling the silence, but her mind was racing. Should she reveal herself right then? Should she call the attendant aside and explain that the very airline logo stitched onto their uniforms represented her company, her investment, her empire? No, she decided to wait. She wanted to see the whole picture, every layer of service, every assumption, every whisper that passengers exchanged. It was only after a small turbulence hit, drinks spilled, and tension rose in the cabin that things began to escalate. One passenger became irate about not getting the meal he wanted, another complained about being cramped. And through it all, the billionaire quietly observed, noting how the attendants responded with varying degrees of professionalism. But then, as if fate had been waiting for the perfect moment to expose the truth, a conversation between two crew members near the galley drifted back to her. They mentioned upcoming executive inspections, hinting nervously about how higher-ups were evaluating staff performance this quarter. That was the trigger. She knew the moment was coming when her identity would no longer be something she could hide. As the cabin settled back into uneasy calm after turbulence, the undercover billionaire leaned against her seat, listening carefully, her heart steady, but her mind alive with thoughts. The whispers between the two flight attendants grew louder as one of them complained about how corporate was always breathing down their necks, sending undercover inspectors to test their service. The irony almost made her laugh aloud, because if only they knew who was sitting crammed between economy seats, sipping water from a plastic cup instead of crystal glass, they would realize that the very inspector they feared was not some anonymous critic, but the owner herself. But she restrained herself, choosing instead to let the moment unfold naturally. The crew passed through again with trays, and when the same attendant who had demoted her from first class came by, she barely made eye contact, simply placing a packaged snack in front of her without a word. The billionaire thanked her softly, her voice warm, and the attendant just nodded curtly, already moving on. It stung. Not because she needed special treatment, but because this was the real test of humanity, how one treats others when they believe the other has nothing to offer in return. Hours into the flight, frustration among passengers began to mount again. One elderly man struggled to get assistance lifting his bag. The attendants brushed past him until the billionaire herself stood up, gently helped him, and received his grateful smile. Another mother juggled her restless toddler, struggling to calm the child while reaching for a dropped bottle. The billionaire bent down, picked it up, and reassured her with a kindness that earned a heartfelt thank you. These small acts didn't go unnoticed. Other passengers began to see her differently, not as some fraud in the wrong seat, but as someone gracious despite the treatment she had endured. Still, the crew remained skeptical, occasionally glancing back at her with narrowed eyes. That was when a commotion near the front of the cabin erupted, a disagreement between a passenger and the staff over a seating mix-up. Voices rose, tensions flared, and the head flight attendant was called. The billionaire watched closely as the lead attendant handled the situation with authority, but also with subtle condescension. Her voice polished for show, but edged with disdain for the passenger she thought unimportant. The billionaire's chest tightened. This was exactly the culture she had been worried about. Rules followed mechanically, politeness delivered only when convenient, but compassion absent where it mattered most. And then, as if destiny aligned, a young businessman seated a few rows ahead suddenly recognized her. He froze for a moment, eyes widening, before whispering to his companion, who nearly choked on his drink. "That's her," he whispered. "That's the investor. She owns part of this airline." The words carried farther than he intended, like a spark igniting dry leaves, and within moments a ripple of realization began spreading. Passengers started turning, one by one, eyes widening, mouths parting in shock, while the attendants blinked in confusion, still oblivious to the gravity of what was happening. The billionaire sat still, calm, watching the truth bloom across the cabin like a sunrise, unstoppable and undeniable. The murmur of recognition rolled through the cabin like a wave, at first subtle, then impossible to ignore. Heads turned, whispers overlapped, and soon the quiet hum of the flight was replaced with hushed excitement. A passenger across the aisle leaned forward, squinting, then gasped audibly, "It really is her." Another one fumbled for their phone, clearly eager to confirm what they thought they were seeing. The billionaire remained composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as though she'd been waiting for this storm all along. The flight attendant, who had initially doubted her, finally noticed the shift in energy. She walked back toward the commotion, irritation etched across her face, until she caught the words that made her freeze mid-step. "She owns this airline." The attendant blinked, her carefully constructed mask of authority beginning to crack. She glanced at the woman she had dismissed earlier, suddenly seeing her not as an intruder, but as someone whose name carried weight far beyond the cabin. Her mouth went dry, her breath caught, and she felt the burn of embarrassment rising up her neck. She hurried forward, crouched slightly, and whispered urgently, "Ma'am, is this true? Are you really?" The billionaire met her eyes calmly, not with anger, but with a quiet strength that seemed heavier than fury itself. "Yes," she said softly, "and I've been watching." Those 4 words struck harder than any lecture could. The attendant's face drained of color, and her hands trembled as she tried to process the magnitude of her mistake. Passengers, now emboldened, began speaking out. "She was sitting here helping people when you ignored them," one man said sharply. "She lifted that gentleman's bag. She helped that mother with her baby, while you brushed them aside." The mother nodded vigorously, adding, "She was kinder to us than your entire crew." The atmosphere shifted completely. Admiration for the billionaire blossomed, while scrutiny and shame fell squarely on the staff who had judged her. The head flight attendant quickly rushed back, having caught the whispers as well, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes betraying panic. She knelt down beside the billionaire, her voice suddenly sweet, apologetic, dripping with respect that had been absent before. "We are so sorry, Miss. We didn't recognize you. Please, allow us to escort you back to your rightful seat in first class." But the billionaire didn't move. She stayed right where she was, her voice steady but firm. "No, I chose this seat, and I will stay here. What matters now isn't my comfort. It's what I've seen. And I've seen enough." That line silenced the cabin entirely. Even the children hushed, as though sensing the gravity of the moment. Passengers stared, wide-eyed, realizing they were witnessing something that would be talked about far beyond this flight. The attendants shifted uncomfortably, trapped between humiliation and fear, realizing every action they had taken was now under a magnifying glass. The billionaire's presence was no longer invisible. It was monumental, undeniable, and every second that passed pressed the weight of truth harder against those who had failed to see her humanity when they thought she was no one. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, as though every word spoken carried more weight than before. The passengers leaned in, waiting to see what the billionaire would say next, while the attendants hovered anxiously, their pride shattered, their authority dissolved. The billionaire sat upright, her posture calm but commanding, and when she finally spoke, her words were measured, deliberate, and filled with the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. "When I boarded this plane," she began, her voice steady enough that even those at the back could hear, "I came not as an owner, not as an investor, not as someone with power. I came simply as a passenger, someone like all of you, wanting to experience this flight as you do every day. What I've seen and felt here today has been eye-opening. I was judged by my clothes, doubted for my ticket, dismissed without a second thought, and moved from a seat I had every right to occupy simply because someone assumed I didn't belong." She let those words linger in the air, piercing through the silence like a blade. Faces in the cabin softened, some nodding in agreement, others looking ashamed of how they had joined in the whispers earlier. The attendant who had first challenged her lowered her eyes, unable to meet the billionaire's gaze, the sting of regret written across her face. The billionaire continued, her voice warming now, not with anger, but with purpose. "The true test of service, the true measure of character, is not how you treat someone you think is important. It is how you treat those you believe are not. Every passenger on this plane is valuable. Every human being here is deserving of dignity and respect. If my presence today revealed anything, it is that judgment blinds us and kindness reveals us. A ripple of applause began, hesitant at first, then growing into a steady wave until nearly the entire cabin clapped, some cheering softly, some even standing to show their support. The billionaire smiled faintly, touched not by the applause but by the realization that the message had landed where it needed to. She turned back to the attendants, offering them not bitterness but a chance at redemption. "This isn't about punishing you," she said firmly. "It's about reminding you that the heart of this airline isn't in the seats or the meals or even the schedules. It's in the way you make people feel. Never forget that." The attendants nodded, tears pricking at the corners of their eyes, humbled in a way no corporate memo could have ever achieved. For the rest of the flight, the atmosphere changed completely. The attendants moved with genuine care, helping passengers, listening to concerns, even smiling in a way that wasn't forced. The passengers, too, seemed lighter, kinder to one another, united by the extraordinary moment they had just shared. And when the plane finally touched down, every person on board knew they had been part of a story they would never forget, a story that would ripple far beyond the walls of that cabin. As she stood to leave, the billionaire adjusted her simple sweater, slung her bag over her shoulder, and walked out not as someone craving recognition, but as someone who had given an unforgettable lesson in humanity. And before we wrap up, if this story struck a chord with you, if it made you reflect on how easily we judge and how important it is to treat everyone with dignity, then make sure you subscribe to this channel. Because we will keep bringing you stories that inspire, stories that challenge perspectives, and stories that remind us of the simple truth. Greatness isn't shown in wealth, it's revealed in kindness.